Hi everybody, it's Dave, the Red Pill Coach, and I'm back again, once again, to teach you guys how to make your life better and how to make your relationships work. So today we are going to continue our discussion of and our introduction to cognitive behavioral therapy. And specifically today we're going to talk about the component of CBT known as behavioral therapy. And I've got quite a story to tell you. However, it's not the full story. And I need to point out right away that humans are not just behavioral creatures. Unlike every animal in the animal kingdom, humans also think, which is why we've linked cognitive and behavioral therapy. What I'm teaching you about now is simply behavioral therapy. It is essentially, as we learned last week, nothing more than animal training. So what is behavioral therapy? Well, it's based on the idea that all living things maintain homeostasis in their body. In other words, they maintain their own separateness from the rest of the world. That's Rush Limbaugh talks about, when you assume room temperature. Well, when you assume room temperature, you are dead. Before that, you strictly maintain your body temperature in a homeostatic environment that's very, very narrow. I mean, it's 37 degrees Celsius, right? It's not 37.2. It's exactly 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Not 98.4, 98.6. So it's a very specific range that living things maintain themselves in. And the other thing that's interesting is this is a characteristic that is ubiquitous to all life. All life not only maintains their internal environment, they pursue positive stimuli that help them maintain their internal environment. And they flee, they swim away from anything that does not help them maintain their internal environment. And this is true all the way up from humans down to rats and hamsters and gerbils, all the way down to single-celled organisms, even primitive bacteria. So long as they've got an ability to move and react, they're going to react when exposed to an aversive stimuli. So all the way from single-celled bacteria all the way to, 100 billion cell human. It's a very remarkably ubiquity in the animal kingdom. All living creatures react to stimuli. Now, do viruses react to stimuli? They don't, because viruses aren't alive. But all living things do react to stimuli, from the most primitive bacteria to the most complicated human being, which gives you an idea of exactly how powerful this is. So let me tell you a neat story. In 1988, 32 years ago, that's right, that's how old I am, guys. 32 years ago, I took my first class in behavior analysis, Psych 2020. It was a wonderful class, and it changed my life. Completely changed my idea of how things work in the world. And we learned all about behavior analysis and behavioral theory, and I'm going to be telling you some of that today. But mostly I want to tell you about the lab we did. We had a lab along with this class, and in the lab, we had a number of assignments, but one of the assignments was a 2-week assignment to train a rat, really to do a ridiculous variety of tasks. We trained the rat to press a bar, to climb a ladder, to cross a bowl of water on a balance beam, then to climb down the ladder on the other side, then to climb up a short ladder on the opposite side and ring a bell. Then to climb down the ladder, go over to the center of the cage and pick up a group of marbles in a plate that was there, lift them up, and lift them into a makeshift basketball hoop. Now think about that. That's a lot of stuff to train a stupid rat how to do. But I did it, and in fact everyone in class did it. I did it in just 8 days. 8 days, 2 hours a day of training is all it took for me to chain the behaviors together and train the rat to do all those tasks. How? How can you train a stupid rat so easily, but it's so hard to train your wife? Well, I gave you the first clue, and that's because humans have cognition. So we can't just completely rely on behavioral training because we can outthink it. So let me give you an example. You might be Chad, right? You might be a stud. Maybe you make her cum buckets. That's very reinforcing to anyone to be able to cum buckets. So therefore, you are reinforcing to her. And having sex with you is reinforcing to her. But then what happens if she catches you cheating like the dog that you are? What happens? Well, she turns it off. Is she still turned on? Does she still get wet thinking about having sex with you? You bet she does. But she's able to turn that off and control it because she's mad. Humans can think. And it reminds me of a poster on the wall of one of my professors. It shows a couple rats, and they're sitting around in class, and the professor's in the front saying, "Stimulus response, stimulus response. Don't you rats ever think?" And that's what you got to watch out for. So be aware of the cognitive component in this, and don't ignore and think that you can just train someone like a rat without repercussions. But these are very powerful techniques nonetheless. So how do you get a rat to do all those things that quickly? It's actually not very hard at all. But the key is to be able to control the rat's environment. And for this we use what's called a Skinner box. This is named after B.F. Skinner, the guru who founded behavioral theory. And what he does is you put a rat inside a cage. And on one side of the cage is a little feeding trough. And you got a button, you can press it. And each time you press the button, a little pellet comes down. And the rat hears that and runs over to the feeding trough and grabs a pellet and chomps it down. So the key is to control the environment. And then, once you have control of the environment, you reward the behavior that you want and you ignore the behavior you don't want. Now, where have we heard that before? Yeah, I think we have heard that before. And what does that look like? Well, with a rat, you got a rat, he's hungry. You give him a pellet every time he does what you want. And he runs over, eats the pellet. Well, you can't exactly do this with a woman because you don't have her in a Skinner box, for one thing. You don't control the environment completely, for another thing. But you can take the principles you learn from this theory and apply them in real life. And probably the main principle that you can take from all this is that in order for a reinforcer to be effective, it has to be highly desired. Let me repeat that. For a reinforcer to be effective, it must be highly desired. So if it's not highly desired, then it's not a reinforcer. Now, what is a reinforcer? A reinforcer is anything that follows a behavior that increases it. Okay? Reinforce. You reinforce a behavior by following it with a pleasant consequence. Your wife makes dinner, give her a hug. Assuming hugs from you are reinforcing, that will make the making dinner behavior more likely to happen in the future. And it's the same way with a rat. If you want a rat to press a bar, you start out by, you don't reinforce him when he presses the bar because they're not going to press the bar right away. You have to break down the behavior. And so you start out, you give him the pellet whenever the rat is in the quadrant of the cave where the bar is you want him to press. And then, it takes about 30 seconds, and the stupid rat is always in that section of the cage. And then you reinforce him only for moving around in that section of the cave, or cage. And then you reinforce him only when he brushes against the bar. Inadvertently, give him 3 pellets when he does that. And then, before long, he accidentally presses the bar, and then you give him a bunch of pellets. And when you do that, they immediately run over to the bar. They don't always press it, but they run over to it because, I was over here, I got the pellets. And before long, they're pressing the bar as fast as they can. It takes literally about 30 minutes, maybe 20, to train a rat to press a bar. They do it very, very quickly. But here is the key ingredient and the secret sauce to behavioral training. And it ties in very nicely with everything we've talked about in terms of dread game. Remember dread game. Dread game is the idea that you have options, and you show your woman you have options. How? By not placating to her, by not patting her on the back all the time, by not rewarding her all the time. And when do you reward her? You reward her when she's doing behavior that you want her to increase. Are we all clear on the connection? I hope so. Because the secret sauce to a Skinner box is starvation. And the secret sauce to dread game, one could argue, is also starvation. Because the way you do it with rats in a training regimen is you let them eat whatever they want, however much they want. I forget, I think it was a month. And then at the end of a month, you cut back their food. And you starve them for basically about a week. And you starve them until they're down to 70% of their free feeding weight. They're not skinny, but they're hungry. And that's when you put them in the Skinner box and start rewarding them with pellets. And boy, do they work hard. And it's the same way with dread game. When you deprive a living organism of the reinforcers that they have grown to expect or that they need, then they work harder to get those reinforcers. So let's make it real, okay? We know how a Skinner box works. We know about stimulus response. And I should tell you there's two types of conditioned responses. There's operant conditioning, which I'm talking about today. Operant conditioning says behavior increases when it's followed by something pleasant, and it decreases when it's followed by something unpleasant. And then there's classical conditioning, which is a paired stimulus. And we've heard of this. These are Pavlov's dogs, right? So he rang a bell and then fed the dogs, and the dogs would see the food and they'd salivate. And it took about 2 or 3 pairs with the bell for the dogs to start salivating just at the bell. So they wouldn't have to smell the food, they wouldn't have to see the food, they would just hear the bell. Why? Because that stimulus was paired together with another stimulus. So they reacted either positively or negatively, in this case positively because they wanted food. But it works with a negative consequence as well. And what does that mean? It means if you're a dick all the time, and your wife associates you with cruelty, with rudeness, with unpleasant thoughts, then you are the negative paired stimulus, and she's going to associate you with negativity. So we'll talk about that in terms of neurolinguistic programming in a little bit, next week or the week after that. Right now we're focusing on operant conditioning, stimulus, response, stimulus, response, stimulus, response. And we're going to break that down. What do you do with specific behaviors in terms of behavioral theory when you have a wife, for example, who is not giving it up? A wife who doesn't want to have sex with you. Well, a basic behavioral paradigm would be that you reward sexy behavior and you punish, or actually it's not punishment, it's extinction. I've talked about extinction before and I'll talk about it again, but there's a slight distinction. Extinction doesn't immediately decrease the behavior. It decreases the behavior over time. And you extinguish the behavior by ignoring it, specifically by removing all the reinforcers to the behavior. And that's the approach. You extinguish the no-sex behavior. How? You ignore it. You don't give her any reinforcers. You don't climb into bed and rub her feet. You don't rub her butt. You don't tell her she's beautiful. You remove the reinforcers. Then you provide the reinforcers when the sexy behavior occurs. It's that simple. But keep in mind that in order for your withdrawal to be reinforcing, or to be not reinforcing, to be negative, in order for your withdrawal to be a negative experience, then it has to be scarce. Let me repeat that. If you want your reinforcer to be powerful And in this case, your reinforcer is the only reinforcer we got, guys, is your time, affection, and attention. If you want your time, affection, and attention to be reinforcing and potent and powerful, then you need to deprive her of it. Think about it. It's the same dynamic. This is where dread game comes in. Let's take another example, complaining behavior. Well, and that's tricky. And I include this because complaining behavior is a behavior. Okay? Not having sex is also a behavior, but it's a negative. It's an affirmative behavior. While complaining is a negative behavior. And it's very, very difficult to decrease a negative behavior. She will drive you absolutely insane if you try to ignore her when she's complaining. This is why I always say, you have to take care of the cognition first. Give your woman 20 to 30 minutes every day of uninterrupted listening. After that, if she starts going off the rails and starts complaining about you, you can end the conversation. And you can literally begin the process of extinguishing that complaining behavior about you. But it's very difficult to reinforce because you don't want to reinforce. How do you reinforce the not complaining? It's kind of tricky. You're reinforcing a negative. So what you need to do is you need to look for good behavior and reinforce that good behavior. Just like the rat in the Skinner box. Start out when she moves in that direction. And then move towards when she's in that quadrant of the cage that you want her. And then when she's touching the bar, when she's actually, being somewhat pleasant. And then finally, when she's laying on her back with her hand out, pressing the bar as fast as she can, that's when you start throwing on the rewards. So, that's the basics about behavioral theory. I've got a lot more to say about this. And next week, I'll talk about classical conditioning, maybe. And I also may get into some more detailed examples on how to behaviorally train your wife. So thank you very much, and I'll check you guys out on the other side.